Estamos ao vivo. Muito bem, boa tarde a todos e todas. Vamos iniciar hoje a última sessão do nosso workshop, Mente e Mundo, com a participação do professor David Horst. O professor David é nosso colega aqui da Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, ele é da Alemanha, né? Realizou sua pesquisa de pós-doutorado na Universidade Hebraica de Jerusalém e na Universidade de Campinas. Estudou filosofia na Freie Universität Berlin e na University of Pittsburgh e também na Universidade de Basel, onde recebeu seu título de doutor em 2010. Sua pesquisa atual concentra-se em questões de metaética, epistemologia e filosofia da mente, especialmente na natureza da agência racional, tanto prática quanto epistêmica. E hoje o professor David vai falar justamente sobre o que é competência epistêmica. O David vai falar em inglês, mas os comentários e a discussão, se quiserem fazer perguntas também pelo chat, pode ser em português. Ele entende perfeitamente, fala muito bem, mas ele...
Bom, mais ou menos, né?
Se sente mais confortável fazendo a apresentação em inglês. Então, sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra para o David e voltamos depois com a nossa conversa.
Então, obrigado, Jonatas. Eu vou falar em inglês, mas como a Jonatas já falou, se vocês querem fazer perguntas, comentários, podem fazer em português. So, my overarching question today is, what sort of power is an epistemic competence? The sort of competence or the sort of capacity that's at work in forming beliefs in response, for example, to perception or to other things that we believe. And to connect this very briefly with the overarching theme of our workshop, Mente e Mundo, one way of putting this question is to ask what sort of power is our capacity what sort of power is the capacity of the mind to enter into cognitive contact with the world. Now, in exploring this question, I'll be taking issue with a popular tendency within contemporary virtue epistemology, according to which epistemic competences are to be understood on the model of skill, or athletic skills such as archery, playing baseball, playing chess, or tennis are the favorite examples. And the most prominent proponent of this tendency is certainly Ernest Sosa, who in a number of important works famously compares the believer to a target shooting archer, right? So on his view, competent belief formation is in all relevant respects just like skillful archery. In both cases, in the case of belief and in the case of archery, full success is in each case a matter of achieving the relevant aim or objective of belief in the one case, which is truth, and hitting the target in the case of archery through a proper exercise of a pertinent skill, a cognitive skill in the one case and an archery skill in the other. But the analogy with skill is hardly unique to Sosa. The relevant literature on virtue epistemology is actually full of examples from the domain of skill. So there are, I've counted basketball players, tennis players, skiers, baseball players, dancers, golfers, chess players, and I'm sure there are many more. Now, what I will be arguing today is two things. First, I want to suggest that skill and epistemic competences are actually importantly and relevantly different sorts of powers. And second, that in fact, epistemic competences resemble virtues rather than skills. And of course, this last claim depends on a distinction between virtue and skill, a distinction that I think can be found in Aristotle, and which I'll be trying to defend in a moment. The overall upshot of this will be that, if I'm right, we should indeed model virtue epistemology on virtue and not on skill, right? So let me say a few more words on what I'm calling skill-based virtue epistemology, which is the name I give to this tendency within contemporary virtue epistemology, of which Ernst Sosa is one of its most prominent defender. Now, the skill conception of epistemic competences is not just evident from their favorite examples. It also underlies, I think, one of the central claims of this tendency, namely that epistemic normativity is a mere special case of the sort of normativity familiar from skillful action, what Sosa calls performance normativity. And I think there are two central claims to skill-based virtue epistemology, which it is helpful to distinguish. So there's the claim that I've called competence account of epistemic normativity, according to which epistemic normativity is to be understood in terms of epistemic competences or powers. The basic idea here is that the evaluation of believers and their beliefs as, for example, rational or justified, tracks the extent to which they possess and exercise relevant competences, relevant epistemic competences. So, for example, on Sosa's view, very roughly, a justified belief just is a competent belief, right? A belief that's the result of an exercise of a corresponding epistemic competence. Now, from this claim, I want to distinguish claim B, the skill account of epistemic competences, according to which epistemic competences can indeed be understood in analogy with or on the model of skill, such as archery, baseball, and chess, right? Such that a competent belief is exactly analogous to a skillful performance. Now, and proponents of skill-based virtue epistemology embrace both claims, endorse both claims, A and B. And if we combine them, we get to their central idea, namely that epistemic normativity is a mere special case of skill normativity. To clarify my objectives, it's important to stress that I'm taking issue only with claim B. I'm fine with claim A, right? I'm actually sympathetic to the idea that we can account, at least for certain central epistemic normative notions, in terms of competences. What I want to object to is just the skill model of competences, right? Claim B, that we can understand epistemic competences in analogy with ordinary skills such as archery, baseball, or chess. Now, the structure of the rest of the talk is as follows. First, I'll argue that virtue and skill are importantly and relevantly different sorts of powers. Second, I'll suggest that epistemic competences differ from skills in much the same way as virtues do, right? And then third, I want to draw the conclusion that the difference between epistemic competences and skills undermines the attempt to understand epistemic normativity as a mere special case of skill normativity, right? But before distinguishing virtue from skill, let me point out a few common characteristics. So I take it that virtue, skill, and epistemic competence are all excellences, which are powers that dispose their possessors to reliably perform well within a certain domain under normal or appropriate conditions, of course. Where performing well is typically a matter of responding to certain factors of one's situation or considerations that bear on what counts as getting things right within the relevant domain, relative to the fundamental aim or the associated norms of that domain. So, for example, a skilled chess player is someone who's capable of performing well within the domain of chess, typically by performing chess moves in response to considerations that bear on the fundamental aim of chess, which I take it is checkmating one's opponent. So when a skilled chess player exercises their chess skill, she will typically do so in response, for example, to the position of the pieces, to the available moves, etc. A kind person, as an example of a virtuous person, is someone who is disposed to perform well within the domain of kindness, typically by acting in response to considerations such as another person's suffering that bear on the fundamental aim of kindness, as, for example, to help others in need. And a competent believer is someone who is disposed to perform well within the domain of belief, typically by forming beliefs in response to considerations such as perceptual indicators of truth that bear on the fundamental aim of belief, which, along with many others, for the purposes of this talk, I take to be truth. Now, to bring out the difference between virtue and skill, I suggest we look at the following two cases, which are also on the handout: playing chess and acting kindly. So consider the first one. While playing chess, you may recognize that moving your knight to b4 would be an excellent chess move. Still, you may not move your knight. This wouldn't automatically call into question your skillfulness at chess, nor does it imply that you somehow failed to properly exercise your skill. You might just want to spare your opponent an embarrassing defeat, or you might have been bribed to make one bad move, or perhaps you've simply lost any interest in continuing to play, right? So what this brings out, I think, is that there's no difficulty for a skilled chess player to refrain from performing what she herself recognizes as an excellent chess move. Or in other words, there's no difficulty for a skilled chess player to refrain from responding to considerations that bear on the fundamental aim of chess. Now, contrast this with virtue. Suppose you encounter a person in need of your immediate assistance, and you recognize the situation for what it is, and you're fully capable of providing relevant assistance. Other things equal, if you are indeed a kind person, then you will provide assistance, or you will at least try to provide assistance. If you don't, then this would demonstrate a lack or a defect of kindness, right? After all, acting kindly, such as assisting others in need, when and where kindness is called for, simply is what a kind person, what being a kind person is all about, right? So, not acting kindly in a situation where kindness is called for is not really an option for a truly kind person. And what this suggests, I think, is that virtue and skill differ in the way in which they dispose their subjects to respond to considerations that bear on their respective aims, or on what is right or appropriate to do in light of these aims or the associated norms. So, for example, when a virtuous person recognizes that fying would be the right thing to do in light of virtuous norms, then, other things equal, this is sufficient for her to actually fy, or to try to fy, right? So this then gives us the following schematic account of virtue. A virtue is a kind of power whose exercises are unconditionally or necessarily responsive to considerations that bear on what's right to do in light of virtue's norms, of course, under normal or appropriate conditions. Now, by contrast, when a skilled agent recognizes that fine would be the right thing to do in light of the skilled norms, then this by itself doesn't settle whether she will actually fine or not. Whether or not she will fine depends on an independent motivational condition, such as a desire, for example, to engage one's skill and to pursue its relevant aim. And independent in the sense that the relevant motivation isn't itself implied or provided for by the skill. The idea here is just that skills don't come with a built-in motivation to engage them on relevant occasions, right? The motivation to engage a skill has, so to speak, has to come from elsewhere. This then yields the following, again, schematic account of skill. A skill is a kind of power whose exercises are only conditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what's right to do in light of the skill's norms, conditional on an independent motivational condition, such as a decision or a desire to pursue the relevant skill's aim. To put it another way, a skilled agent need not exercise their relevant skill on relevant occasions. It's enough that they're capable of doing so, right? By contrast, to be virtuous, it is not enough that one is merely capable of doing the virtuous thing. One must actually do it on relevant occasions, right? Other things being equal. So it's part, if you like, it's part of the possession conditions of virtue that one is moved by considerations that bear on the virtuousness of one's acts. By contrast to skills, where it is not part of the possession conditions of a skill that one is moved by considerations that bear on the skillfulness of one's actions, right? One can be a fully skilled person, a truly skilled chess player, and yet decide not to exercise one's skill on some occasions that would not automatically undermine the possession of one's skill. Now, with this distinction in the background, let's move to epistemic competences. What I will be arguing now is that, in fact, if anything, epistemic competences resemble structurally the sort of power that I've called virtue, and not skills, right? And to bring this out, consider that if epistemic competences were indeed like skills, as proponents of skill-based virtue epistemology claim, we should expect that they work in fundamentally similar ways. So, for example, we should expect that, just like in the case of skill, there's no difficulty for a competent believer to refrain from believing P in the face of considerations that bear positively on the fundamental aim of belief, namely truth. So, in other words, there should be no difficulty for a competent believer to refrain from believing P in the face of considerations that show P to be true, right? Just like there's no difficulty in refraining from performing a certain chess move in the face of considerations that show that to be an excellent chess move. But I take it this is clearly the wrong predictions. What we expect from competent believers is that they are robustly responsive to considerations that bear on the correctness or truth of their beliefs. And to illustrate this, consider the following example from Sosa, Sosa's basketball player. And here I quote, aims external to the skill domain might, of course, probably motivate a performer to take an outrageous risk. Thus, a basketball player might be offered a vast sum for taking a shot from across the full length of the court and might thus act quite rationally and appropriately in taking that shot, all things considered. But the shot is then still bad as a basketball shot because of how poorly selected or negligent it is, end quote. So I take it that this is a case where a skilled basketball player knowingly takes a bad shot. He knowingly ignores what taking a good shot would require, and he does so in order to win the large sum of money. Now, if epistemic competences were like skills, we should expect that something similar is possible also in the epistemic domain. And to take it that an analogous epistemic situation would be something like the following. You're offered a vast sum of money for forming an outrageously risky belief. A belief that, given your evidence, will most likely miss the mark of truth. But famously, in contrast to the situation of Sosa's basketball player, this isn't something one can simply pull off, right? I mean, if I were to offer you the notorious $1 million to now believe that it's raining, while you're standing outside and the sun is shining, you won't be able to form the belief that it is raining, right? So in other words, epistemic competences preclude believers to knowingly form bad beliefs or to knowingly violate the aims or norms of the epistemic domain. And this is crucially different from skills. A skill doesn't preclude the skilled basketball player to deliberately or knowingly take a bad shot, right? Now, if something like this is correct, then I think the following characterization of epistemic competences is plausible, which is the one I've called necessary responsiveness, according to which normally exercises of your epistemic competences are necessarily responsive to considerations that bear on what's correct to believe in light of the truth norm, such that A, if you possess sufficient evidence for P, then normally you will believe P, and B, if you possess sufficient evidence against P, then normally you will believe not P. Now, there are various things to say about necessary responsiveness. I think we might do that. We might talk about this further in the Q&A. For now, I would just want to highlight, because it's important for the overall argument, that that I take evidence here to be a notion that might be understood just as well along internalist or mentalist lines, and externalist lines, right? So I'm not taking this to back any questions against the externalist tendencies of virtue epistemology. So in other words, I intend necessary responsiveness to be completely neutral in this regard. Now, importantly, if something like necessary responsiveness is indeed correct, then epistemic competences do resemble virtues rather than skills. Epistemic competences and virtues exhibit the same general sort of responsiveness, right? Both dispose the subjects to be unconditionally responsive to considerations that bear on what counts as getting things right in light of their respective aims or norms. So, and in that regard, they both differ from skills. Skills need not be exercised. A skilled basketball player might choose not to take a shot, even though she is in an excellent position to score. By contrast, epistemic competences and virtues are such that normally they are necessarily exercised on occasions that call for their exercises. Right? Now I want to move on to the third and last part, epistemic normativity, where I want to argue that the difference between epistemic competences and skills undermines the attempt to construe epistemic normativity as a mere special case of skill normativity, as proponents of skill-based virtue epistemology try to do. So, and just to remember, what connects the normative issue with the reflections on skill and epistemic competences is the general competence theoretic approach to epistemic normativity, claim A, from the beginning. If you remember this claim here, the competence account of epistemic normativity, according to which epistemic normativity is to be understood in terms of epistemic competences, right? Such that epistemic evaluations of believers track the proper workings of the relevant epistemic competences. Now, what we've seen is that, in fact, skills and epistemic competences do work quite differently, such that competent believers are necessarily responsive to considerations that bear on how to comply with certain norms, whereas skilled agents are only conditionally responsive to such considerations. So given this difference and given the general competent theoretic approach to epistemic normativity, claim A, what we should expect is that there's a corresponding difference between epistemic evaluations on the one hand and skill evaluations on the other. An evaluative difference that corresponds to the difference in which these powers, epistemic competences and skills, tend to operate. And to bring this out, I will focus on the example of assessment of epistemic rationality. And here's an example with which think might be helpful. Election night. Suppose it's election night, and as the results come in, it becomes increasingly clear that Trump has won a second term. At some point during the night, the only epistemically rational response to your evidential situation is to believe that Trump was indeed re-elected, regardless of how painful or discomforting adopting this belief might be for you. Any other response would certainly reflect negatively on you as a believer, and so would, for example, trigger a charge of epistemic irrationality. Now, the problem for the skill model is that if we were to conceive epistemic competences on the model of skill, it's unclear why there should be anything wrong with the competent believer who refrained from believing that Trump was re-elected. Because after all, this is just how skills work. You respond to considerations bearing on your skills characteristic aim only when and as long as you desire to pursue this aim. And here in electionite, we presumably have a case where you prefer comfort over truth, right? You might just want to spend one more night in blissful ignorance before having to confront the bleak reality of another 4 years of Trump. So consequently, assuming the skill model, mere conditional responsiveness to one's evidence is exactly what we should expect from a competent believer. That is, we should expect that there are occasions on which a competent believer refrains from complying with her evidence, namely those situations where compliance with her evidence would have undesirable consequences, such as in our example, election night. But I mean, plainly, this is the wrong prediction. Now, by contrast, if we conceive of epistemic competences on the model of virtue, I do think that we get the right prediction, that we get the right verdict. If you didn't respond to your evidence by believing that Trump was reelected, this would certainly imply a lack of failure of epistemic competence on your part. And thus it would underwrite a negative epistemic evaluation, a charge of epistemic irrationality. And this is because virtue is the sort of power that equips you with an unconditional responsiveness to considerations that bear on what counts as getting things right within that power's domain. Now, to sum this up, I think the trouble for skill-based virtue epistemology is this, can be summarized as follows. If we were to conceive of epistemic competences on the model of skill, we should expect competent believers to be merely conditionally responsive to their evidence, because that's just how skills work, right? They equip their subject with a conditional responsiveness to considerations that bear on the relevant aim or norm, constitutive of the domain of that skill. But plausibly, epistemic rationality requires unconditional responsiveness to one's evidence. What we expect from a from a rational believer is that she responds to her evidence, and she does so unconditionally, not just when and as long as she has an independent motivation to do so. So this shows, I think, that there's at least one dimension of epistemic normativity, namely assessments of epistemic rationality, that cannot be understood as a mere special case of skill normativity. Such assessments just have no structural analog in the realm of skill. And so if all this is right, then the upshot would be that virtue epistemology should indeed be based on virtue and not on skill. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for this very clear presentation. Let me bring everybody back for the discussion. For those who are in the comment section on YouTube and Facebook, you can ask questions in English if you want. E para quem estiver nos ouvindo, também vocês podem fazer perguntas em português e a gente vai passar para o David depois. Então, temos perguntas? Alguém gostaria de começar? André? O teu microfone está mudo, André.
Não estou ouvindo.
Ele pediu para esperar.
Okay, now it's better. I just got the second half of your presentation, but I was wondering, do you deal also with the fact that through time, competences change? So, for example, one person can get into have a new competence, and she can, and the idea that this is not reversible. She cannot step back and go back willfully to the state that she was there before. Do you also deal with that, or maybe not so?
Yes, I mean, I think. So let me put it this way. I think that that epistemic competences, virtues, and skills are all acquired powers, right? They have to be learned or acquired through practice. Now, and they, in a certain sense, they can be perfected over time, and in that sense also changed over time. But there's a certain sense in which I mean, this is clear in the case of, it's also a point that Aristotle makes when discussing the difference between skill and virtue, and I think something similar applies to epistemic competences. It isn't easy to imagine a virtuous person who deliberately decides to cease being virtuous, right? Because that would be imagining someone, that would be imagining a virtuous person who decides or chooses to not respond to a situation in which it is clear that according to virtue she would need to help another person, right? That's difficult to imagine. Such a person, it seems more natural to say is either someone who has never been truly virtuous in the first place, or someone who has already lost their virtue, right? And this contrasts with skill, because in the case of skill, there is no difficulty of imagining a skilled person that decides for whatever reason to no longer exercise their skill, right? You might imagine a skilled piano player or skilled basketball player that for some reason they decide, well, now it's enough. I don't want to. I played basketball all my life. I've had enough, right? And I think also with respect to that distinction, with respect to that difference between skill and virtue, epistemic competences are on the side of, if anything, on the side of virtue rather than on the side of skill, because it's equally difficult to imagine the competent believer who at some point tries to decide no longer to respond to various factors in their surrounding that bear on truth, right? And so yes, I mean, I would think that that once again there's a crucial difference between skill and virtue. That when we ask where do epistemic competences fit in, once again they resemble more the sort of power that we call a virtue than a skill. Unlike what proponents of skill-based virtue epistemology tend to claim or suggest.
Yeah, it's as if you wanted to be literate again, and would any of us would decide to be able to look at the text in a known language and decide not to read it.
Right.
We want to step back and be literate again.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
I mean, yeah.
Okay.
Eu posso fazer a pergunta em português, David?
Claro.
Mas sobre esta comparação, então, a sua proposta então, sua sugestão é pensar o conhecimento ou competência para conhecer como virtude. E você respondeu ao André, sim, nesse sentido de que você tem que adquirir, né? Você tem que, então, a virtude você adquire treinando. Assim, que tipo de adquisição, que tipo de treino seria, porque estou pensando, talvez que tipo de, assim, em que sentido, no caso, assim, o exemplo que você deu, né, chegar à crença, chegar à convicção de que está chovendo, que tipo de, como dizer, adquirir, que tipo de treino seria necessário para adquirir como se adquire essa competência de reconhecer que está chovendo? Como se adquire isso? Você poderia explicar um pouco isso, para eu entender melhor essa comparação com virtude?
Tá. So I'm thinking that, I mean, whatever one's theory of I don't know, acquisition of learning how to deploy concepts in judgments and beliefs is, I mean, that's going on. That's something you have to go through in order to be a competent believer, right? And similarly, I mean, you just, I mean, you're not, I mean, in my view, these are competences that have to be when we grow up, that are being acquired over time and with a lot of teaching, with a lot of interaction with our surroundings, with our parents, etc. I mean, it doesn't matter for my purposes what exactly the right theory of that would be. I think, but I mean, that's a level, I think, where, or that's a respect in which I don't think there is much of a difference between skills, virtues, and epistemic competences. I mean, these are all powers that have to be acquired through a lot of training and practice. What is different is that once acquired, virtues are, if you like, self-maintaining or self-reinforcing, because the sort of power that you have acquired is one that disposes you to unconditionally respond to certain situations, right? So if you're in a certain situation in which someone needs help, then you will respond in a certain way. Similar with epistemic competences. If you are in possession of sufficient evidence for believing P, then you will normally respond by believing P. In that sense, these powers are self-reinforcing or self-maintaining. Skill, on the other hand, is a kind of power where you always need something else, an independent motivation, in order for that power to be engaged or exercised on a particular occasion. Like for a skilled person, at least in principle, there's always this question whether or not she should pursue the aim of checkmating their opponent, right? That question is not in itself settled, but the mere possession of the skill. Whereas for a virtuous person, I mean, it's not an open question whether or not she should help the person in need, right? But per definition, I mean, by being virtuous, by possessing the virtue, this question is already settled for you, right? And something similar, once again, I think holds for epistemic competences. There's no, I mean, if you are in possession of sufficient evidence for believing P, it's not an open question for you whether or not you should go on and actually believe that, right? And so so once again, I think I'm virtue, skill, and epistemic competences resemble one another in being acquired powers, but they differ in the way in which they are exercised, but also in the way in which they continue to exist.
David, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So I'm pretty much convinced of what you said. I was a little bit skeptical last year, but now I think I've been taken in, and
It took me a year to convince you.
I basically think you've got a good point there, and I don't have anything to add. So I'm just gonna ask you a question that might push back a little bit on what you've said about skills, and see what you have to say. Okay?
Of course.
So it seems that some of the skills that we learn are such that once they are learned, you can't just unlearn them. For example, once you've learned how to speak Portuguese or German fluently, it's sort of hard for you to speak bad German or bad Portuguese. If someone asks you a question, you immediately respond with the level of skill that you've already acquired. So there seems to be something there that's sort of automatic. Your response is automatic. And I would be almost tempted to say that it's sort of like an unconditional response. So let's say if you were a virtuous guitar player or piano player, you sit in front of a piano, of course you might try to play really badly the piano, but what comes naturally to you is your skillful playing of the piano. So in these situations, it seems to me a little bit harder to distinguish between skills and virtues. No? What would you say?
No, yes, I think I agree. It's just that I mean, in principle, I think there's no difficulty even for the most skilled piano player to play a piece incorrectly or wrongly, right? That might not be the most natural thing for that person to do when put in a situation where there's an occasion to play the piano. But it's something that is certainly, I mean, that poses no difficulty, right? Whereas I mean, this is different in the case of I mean, there's no, I mean, we have no difficulty imagining a skilled piano player who decides to, for whatever reason, plays a piece badly or incorrectly. This by itself would not undermine their skillfulness, right? Whereas a virtuous person, right, who doesn't help someone in need, and she's completely capable of helping, etc., etc. If still that person does not even try to be helpful in that situation, that would indeed put into question whether or not that person really is virtuous, right? Possesses full virtuousness. And that's the difference. I mean, there's just like, by refraining to exercise the relevant power in the case of skills, this does not automatically undermine the ascription of the relevant power skill. But in the case of virtue, that is just different. I mean, if a person really does not respond to a situation where another person is in desperate need for help, then that would undermine the ascription, the attribution of that power, of that virtue to that person. That's the, I mean, that's the important difference.
Right. So, but I think I'm fine with that. I think there is a distinction. I'm just, my question was sort of trying to get at the finer levels of the distinction, because if you're really, really skilled at doing something, then you'd have to make an effort to do whatever you do unskillfully. And so skillfulness comes in degrees, and the more skilled you are, the harder it is for you to not to exercise that skill in the level that you're fluent in. Likewise with virtue, I think virtues also come in degrees. Someone can be more or less virtuous at doing something, and then you have these intermediary cases where the distinction would be somewhat harder, I guess. So a virtuous piano player would have to make an effort not to play as skillfully as she is used to. Likewise, a virtuous person would have to make an effort to act unvirtuously.
Right, but the point is that in the one case, it doesn't undermine our description of skillfulness, whereas in the virtue case, it does put that into question, right? I mean, a person who makes a great effort to hurt someone else or not to help, I mean, is by the usual standards, is just not a virtuous person, right? So that's the difference. I might want to add one more thing, which is, I mean, an additional difference, which is not, I mean, because, well, it's not essential for the purposes of my talk, but I think that, for example, to make certain mistakes deliberately requires a high level of skill. So, for example, imagine, I mean, you can only make deliberate mistakes in certain areas, like in piano playing or something, if you are a skilled piano player, right? Or you can misspell deliberately a word only if you're a skilled speller, right? So I think, and this is because, I mean, in Aristotle's terminology, this means that skills are two-way powers. They can be exercised in two different ways, either in accordance with the norms or contrary to the relevant norms. His example is the physician, the doctor, who possesses medical skill, and he can put this skill, right, this know-how, to use in two different ways, either by trying to heal the patient or by harming the patient, right? You can only, I mean, you have to possess the relevant skill, the relevant medical skill, to know exactly how much poison to give to that person, to hurt that person, right? So I think, unlike, there's nothing analogous, structurally analogous in the case of virtue, right? Virtue doesn't put you in a position to act virtuously or viciously, right? A virtuous person is someone who responds to certain situation in a certain way, whereas a skill is the sort of power that puts you in a position to act in two contrary ways, right? So unlike a bit unlike what you suggested earlier, that a skilled person cannot make mistakes or has a hard time making mistakes. I think, I mean, certain mistakes actually are only available to make for a possession, for someone who possesses the relevant skill, right? You can only deliberately harm a person by administering a certain amount of poison or something if you possess the relevant medical know-how, if you know what would be harmful to a person, right? You can only play a wrong note while playing a complicated piece of piano if you are a skilled piano player, right? Deliberately. So again, I think skills put one in a position are compatible, first of all, with not exercising them, but that's the important distinction for the purpose of my talk. But I would also be willing to go as far as to argue that they are also compatible, perfectly compatible with exercising them against the fundamental relevant norms of the relevant skill domain.
Yes, I think, well, I don't know if anyone has any other questions. Just one last comment then. This reminded me, what you're saying now, reminded me of a survey that was done some years ago with philosophers, asking them how they would act in specific situations so as to test their degree of ethical behavior among philosophers. And it turned out that the people who behaved most unethically in philosophy were the professors of ethics, right? So because they have all these skills, they have all this knowledge, and they can argue their way out of any situation. So they have the skills to justify for themselves the mistakes that they are making, whereas other people, they're just not as skillful in making up any excuses. So they just have to go along with the virtues that they have.
No, but
so I think
this is because most ethics professors are consequentialists, and so so of course they would act wrong.
I'll try to ask to formulate a question that is related to this example that Rogério gave. But first of all, let me say that I am on the same boat as Rogério. I heard a similar talk last year. I was more skeptical about it. Now I'm less. And it's hard to ask questions when you don't find, I don't know, mistakes or unclarity. So I'm trying to formulate a general question that is somehow external to your main point, but I'd like to hear more about your conception of rationality that it's on the background of this distinction between virtue and skill. I'll put it like this. It's kind of silly, but let's see if it works. Imagine I want to create an artificial being that is rational. I suppose we would start by, and this is actually what happened, I suppose, but that doesn't matter. Trying to make a being that is capable of making inferences, acting according to rules, perceiving differences, applying concepts, general concepts to particular instances, and so forth. And then I arrive at some point at a machine that, for example, is capable of playing chess very skillfully, and it can win any human being. But it's hard to think of... my question is more or less this, if I have an artificial intelligence, as we already have, that are very good at playing chess and other games, but they are not, of course they are, at least they are not, still not good at making distinctions that a virtuous person would do. So a machine would never consider if the right move, if it should do the right move now because it can hurt other person's feelings or something like that. So in that case, would you say that this machine lacks rationality, or because rationality implies practical rationality, something like that? Or should we distinguish theoretical and practical rationality and say that it has one, but it doesn't have the other. So my question is not really about artificial intelligence, but about the connection between these faculties. In our case, if you think necessarily for someone to be rational, it must be capable of more than just skills, something like virtues.
Right. So, I mean, I'm not taking a stand on what's required for practical rationality, or what is practical rationality. The only point I was trying to make that that epistemic rationality is understood, but cannot be understood on the model of skill, but is better understood on the model of virtue. So so that, I mean, that leaves open, and I mean also all this is presupposing what I've called claim A, that you really want to spell out normative assessments, assessments of rationality, for example, in terms of competence. Right? If you conceive of such evaluations or assessments as tracking relevant epistemic competences of the believer, right? And then once and I agree with virtue epistemology that this is a promising way to go. The disagreement comes in when we ask, but then how are we to understand the relevant sort of competence? And what I'm pushing against is the idea that the sort of competence that's in play in underwriting or in grounding in a certain sense, if you like, our epistemic evaluations or assessments is exactly analogous to the sort of competence that's at work in archery, in baseball, in tennis. In other words, is well understood on the model of skill, right? But in saying all this, I'm not taking a stand on how best to conceive a practical rationality, or even what the relation is between practical rationality and epistemic rationality.
But just make sure you don't think that your description of epistemic virtues necessarily imply that the epistemically virtue agent has to be practically virtues or morally virtues, because the example gave me that impression. That's the reason why I thought Rogério's case could.
No.
I won't play because I can hurt the other's feelings. This sounds to me as a.
Yeah, but this is just an example. I mean, you can change that example. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I'm not. I don't want to suggest that in order to be epistemically competent, in the sense that I'm trying to bring out, where the relevance of competence is to be understood on the model of virtue, that this has any implications for whether or not you're morally or ethically virtuous, right? This is a further question. I'm only interested in the merely structural similarity or analogy between the sort of competence that's at work in competently forming beliefs and in ethical virtue. But really, I mean, it's only a structural similarity or analogy because it's only concerned with the sort of responsiveness at issue in both cases, right? The modality of responsiveness in both cases is similar. It's unconditional responsiveness, right? But there's no implication as to whether or not, in order to possess epistemic competences, you also have to possess ethical virtues or moral virtues, right? It's just a comparison, a structural comparison between the way in which two sorts of powers operate or work. So in that regard, my view is also different from a view that's often called virtue responsibilism, according to which intellectual virtues such as open-mindedness, intellectual humility, curiosity should play an important role in epistemology, right? And these are, I mean, on this conception of intellectual virtues are much closer to certain moral virtues, right? But as far as I'm concerned, a competent believer, someone fully possessing epistemic competence, in my sense, that's completely compatible with not being open-minded, with not being intellectually curious. So I'm not taking a stand on whether or not these character traits with which proponents of virtue responsibilism are interested in, whether or not they ought to play an important or even essential role in assessing believers.
No, it's clearer now. I think my intuition is more on the side of this last position that you described, that what is lacking for us to create an artificial being that is epistemically virtuous is something like those character traits, because otherwise they have everything that are very skilled. They are perfectly skilled in a sense. They can be, but there's something lacking. But anyway,
but the thing is, I mean, no. But the thing is that, I mean, it seems that, I mean, even a closed-minded person can acquire knowledge of her surroundings, right? I mean, if she sees a computer in front of her, forms the belief that there's a computer in front of her, that she might arrive at a justified belief and perhaps even at knowledge. And it's not clear that to possess this epistemic standing, she would also need necessarily to possess and have exercised any of these more fancy responsibilist virtues, such as open-mindedness, curiosity, intellectual courage, etc. So here, I mean, with respect to that question, I'm actually with Sosa and Greco. It's just that I think, unlike Sosa and Greco, that the relevant sort of competence at work in informing beliefs also about one's immediate environment are better understood on the model of virtue, structurally speaking, right? And not on skill, right? So whereas virtue responsibilists, they tend to conceive of intellectual virtues as intellectual virtues as a subclass of moral virtues, right? That's not my position, right? I don't think that epistemic competences, or what I would call epistemic virtues, is a subclass of moral virtues, right? Because moral virtues have to do with actions, and that's why virtue responsibilists tend to focus on actions of inquiry, right? They're concerned with the norms and standards of good inquiry, right? And epistemic competences, on the other hand, what I'm interested in are powers that that are exercised in believing certain things or forming certain other doxastic attitudes, not primarily with inquiry. So what I'm saying, what I'm trying to defend, is neutral in a way, with respect to the role that these responsibilist virtues, such as open-mindedness, intellectual courage, etc., should play in epistemology.
Thank you. I'll stop here, otherwise I will monopolize the discussion. Any further question from you guys? Otherwise, perhaps we should call it a day. Ok. Bom, acho que eu vou terminar em português, porque é o nosso público, não sei quem mais está ouvindo, mas muito obrigado de novo a todos e todas os participantes aqui das mesas e também ao público que nos acompanhou. Quem sabe a gente, depois a gente poderia pensar em tornar esse workshop algo um pouco mais permanente, né? Independente do PROCAD. Eu acho que a gente tem vários interesses de pesquisa em comum que a gente pode, aos poucos, ir dialogando mais no futuro. Se alguém tiver alguma consideração final.
Eu só quero também agradecer todos e todas pela participação, e também espero que um dia a gente vai poder repetir esse tipo de evento no modo presencial.
Isso aí, então. Muito obrigado e até a próxima.
Tchau, tchau.